y'all for coming to our series. One more class next week. Lynette is going to speak, and Lynette is requested that people bring their favorite Bible verse for next week if they come. So they have homework for next week.
Great verse.
But we'll focus on today, and today Conrad Brenneman, and never people here, a lot of people know him and watched his journey, and but then there's a big piece of the journey that's missing. That is after we launched him and helped launch him, or hopefully didn't trim his wings too much. But Conrad Brenneman, come up here, Conrad.
All right, thank you.
Grew up in the church. Probably some of us, he was in VBS with some of us as teachers, probably.
Yeah,
Back in the day, right?
most certainly.
Dear God, thank you for the privilege of having Conrad here to talk about his journey, and thanks for the many blessings you've given him and how he has blessed our congregation, help him speak the truth and learn the truth and continue on his journey.
Well, Mr. Studer told like half of it. Yeah, so my name is Conrad. That's what it says on my name tag, at least. Which is weird coming in, they print your name tag for you. So I was like, so right now, maybe you don't know, but I teach science in Oakland, California at a high school there, downtown, right in the middle of the city. If you've been around Oakland, it's very close to the city center. It has like all sorts of hustle and bustle going on. So, but yeah, I grew up here, and yeah, many of you did teach me or guide me or lead me or tell me to stop goofing off at one point. So I'm very thankful to be speaking to you. When Mr. Studer first reached out to me, I was like, yeah, I'm sure a bunch of these people already know most of the things I have to say because they were included in the story. They were like there for it happening and probably remember it better than I do. And then I was looking at the other people on the lineup and I was like, oh shoot, this is a stacked group. It's like, I don't really know how I'm fitting into this. But anyway, I accepted the invitation, and I'm not like an expert in theological mysteries or the formation of the church, nor do I claim to know Jesus more intimately than any of you. So that's not really the point of what I have to say, but I think maybe there's something unique in my personal faith journey that people don't know yet somehow. So that's what I'm here to share about. So this church I attended for the entire early period of my life. My parents have been members here for a very long time. They're some of the super members like you all. It's like I remember when just this last week when Ben and I were doing RSG stuff, like every room that we went into, we were like, oh yeah, that's like a super first Pres member. It was like, all the people who like are consistently here at just volunteering and helping out at the church. And during the clothing program, they're rattling off all the people who are helping, and it's just like the Hall of Fame for First Pres Reforest. Yeah, Fosters are on there too. So, but yeah, so my mom has been doing work with the young kids for a very long time. She was a Sunday school teacher. She used to have the room right in the basement by the men's restroom over in this corner until it became a music room, but then it unbecame a music room. I don't even know what it's being used for now. And my dad, when I was growing up, he was a deacon for a little while, and now he's an elder, which is cool. He might be here, I'm not sure. Hey, Dad. Yeah, I was sort of just locked into coming here. It was something that our family did on Sundays. And I remember probably bumping into you all as I was running around the halls like a maniac with all the other little kids who, yeah, Chuck's nodding. He's like, yeah. And but my very first memories of this church, other than just, eating ice cream and doing other fun stuff, were, vague images of the choir singing or the organ playing, maybe some sermons that I wasn't very excited about sitting through that were kind of boring, in the lull between the different Sunday school options. And, some handbells were in there too. But I didn't really, like most little kids, I didn't really understand the real significance of why I was here and why my family was so engaged with being here, or why Jesus was like the most important thing I'd ever learned about. That was sort of lost on me at a young age. And if you had encountered me back then, you would probably remember shy, reserved, somewhat socially inept kid, perhaps mischievous, misbehaved, but nonetheless curious about Jesus. I think I was starting to develop that hunger that little kids can sometimes develop for learning more about what the gospel is. And I didn't really understand why, but it was evident that the church community was a unique community. It wasn't like other places that I had been, other friends that I had met. So that was sort of, then there's a bunch of other boring stuff in there until I went to middle school. So I think when I went to Roosevelt over there, that's when I think my story started to become more of my own instead of my family's. So like many students entering junior high, it's a very transformative time for a variety of reasons. We learned that firsthand this week during RSG, for both people developing faith and also people developing strange body odors. It was like a fun time on all fronts. But my faith, I remember, became a much more important part of my life during my middle school period. Back then I was still pretty scrawny, not to really haven't changed, but I was much shorter than I was today. And I had a very difficult time making friends. I remember a lot of the conversations that I had when my mom would pick me up from school. She would say, "Why are you sitting over there by yourself?" Or, "Why don't you join in with this game or do this?" And I didn't really have an answer for that. I just, felt uncomfortable a lot of the times going out and meeting people. And Roosevelt treated me pretty well, but it wasn't perfect. So there were, like many middle schools, there were bullies on the prowl, and I fell subject to them. And I will say this: I do remember times where I was instigating incidents against other people. It's like that cruel middle school period where you have to strike or you are struck. It's like, it was not good. I was not very fond of just the middle school time, but I do remember there were a lot of teachers there who were really excellent. And I'll get to them soon. But there were a few bright spots in my period, and most of them did come from the teaching staff who were at the school, as well as a few select friends who I managed to make somehow, and of course Birch Pres a few blocks away. So in the summers, I went through Ready, Set, Go as a camper, which I remember very fondly. And this hopefully, I think, is an indication as to Ben Hancock and I say that we have Ready, Set, Go addictions. We keep coming back for some reason. And I think it's because RSG for us was a very impactful time when we were campers. And then when we went to be leaders in high school, we continued. It's a really excellent program. In case you somehow aren't familiar with all the stuff that goes on during RSG, it's one of the things that I think this church does really well. And now that I've actually been to another church, that comes later on in the story. I've seen that, among the youth programs, what we had at First Presbyterian Forest was especially awesome. And I know Ms. Studer was one of our youth elders for a while. And I remember you doing a lot of work with us when I was in the program. What's my name?
What's her name?
Oh, Ms. Studer?
No,
I don't know if it's
Mary.
Mary. Mary and Terry, yeah. And there were a few members of this congregation who were very impactful to me when I was a middle school age. Mr. Brown was the first one of them. Greg Brown, he was one of my first small group leaders. So we had, and for 7th graders, we had like a pretty serious small group, I think. Now that I have seen what other 7th graders are up to, I'm like, okay, yeah, we were. I mean, the first, half hour, we just went downstairs to the youth room and we whacked each other around with pillows and played the really old Nintendo 64 that was down there. Oh my gosh. And many of the game cartridges didn't really work. I remember these details very vividly. But then when Mr. Brown finally got us to focus and pay attention, we had conversations that were actually provocative to a young person's faith. And I still remember a lot of the things that we did in that small group were really influential. Back then we also had, there were a lot of different Sunday school teachers. We had enough Sunday school teachers where like every grade or every 2 grades had their own class. Maybe we still have that, I don't know. But Mr. Holkabor, oh, that was a weird voice crack. Mr. Holkabor was one of my Sunday school teachers. And he went really deep. Some days we would just have a bunch of questions about like the first 2 things that he said, and we'd go off on some random tangent. And there were questions about like really philosophical, like good versus evil type questions. So I think we dabbled in some predestination. Mr. Holkabor was like, it was there for it though. He was there to satisfy a lot of the curious things that we were asking. And then the third person I wanted to mention at this juncture was Mr. Hancock, who's not here with us because he's on a bicycle trip. But not only was he I remember him, he would be down with us during Sunday school time. Sometimes he had his guitar with him. Sometimes he was helping us set up or referee different games that we were playing. He was also my gym teacher for 3 years over at the middle school. And for someone who wasn't the most athletic and hadn't, had the growth spurt yet, where I was dominating all the sports. In middle school, if you're a middle school boy, the fast track to being popular is being really athletic, which I wasn't. But Mr. Hancock was always looking out for me. I remember over there in the gym at Roosevelt, several times he intervened on my behalf to prevent whatever awful thing was probably going to happen. So I always remember being like profoundly grateful for Mr. Hancock, and I didn't really know obviously he had a very long career over at Roosevelt. I'm sure countless other kids who were in his class were equally, if not more, grateful for what he was able to do. And so through all of these 3 leaders in the church, I really looked up to all 3 of them, and I became more curious as to how God's presence was supposed to feel. And I thought this was interesting because I'd grown up reading all of the Bible stories. And yet I still hadn't had any encounters with some Middle Eastern guy with holes in his hands, right? So I hadn't seen him on my road to Damascus or anything like that. He didn't come down in some blinding lights, nor had I heard any booming voices from heaven, hadn't had any divine dreams with hidden messages, seen any doves descending, hadn't really seen any of those. No tongues of fire or earthquakes or whirlwinds, burning bushes, pillars of cloud, or even talking donkeys. I hadn't seen any of those. So I knew all the stories. Like I had read the stories, I had studied the stories. By middle school, I was completing like a complete read through of the Bible. So like I knew what other people, how they had encountered God. But I didn't really know how I was supposed to encounter him. It was sort of like a nebulous concept. And it was one of those questions that maybe even in Mr. Holkabor's Sunday school class, you weren't really supposed to ask. How am I supposed to encounter God? I remember Pastor Rich Davis doing a sermon series on questions you're not supposed to ask. And I remember like sneaking into the sanctuary a few times to sort of listen in. So I was starting to become really curious. But I remember it was the story of Elijah when he was on the run. What was the king's name? Ahab? Ahab, yeah. And he was sort of like off in the mountains. It was after he had sort of put to shame all the prophets of Baal. Ben taught me how to pronounce it, by the way. And you know, they did the whole thing with they had doused the altar in water, and they were like, oh, he's never going to be able to like this. But then he was on the run, and he went into these caves, and there was like, you know, the earth trembled, there was a huge storm, and there was like a wildfire or whatever. But God wasn't in any of those things. Instead, God was in a whisper that sort of came by and said, why are you here? So I was looking out for the whisper. That was the thing that I could most clearly identify might be the way that God was trying to speak to me. I was like, okay, yeah, I'm not encountering any of these supernatural events that are happening, but maybe I just have to quiet down a little bit and listen for the whisper of the Lord. So I started to become more and more interested in the youth activities, because Paul Daly was the youth pastor at the time, and there was a very vibrant community. There were all sorts of different faces and people who were sort of here, both other kids and then high school kids. And there were like a whole host of youth volunteers and youth leaders who were around. And I started going to Jam. I remember my dad dropping me off at like the one day when they like bumped the 6th graders up to Jam. Yeah, I remember him dropping me off for that. And I was like a little nervous, but I remember going and I had a lot of fun. So I was like, yes, this is something I want to do next year when I'm a 7th grader. And we went on the 7th grade winter retreat up to Timberley. And that's when I remember I was like, yeah, this is the whisper of the Lord. Yeah, speaking. The whisper of the Lord is here. And I'm sure if you talk to many of the 7th and 8th graders who were on that trip, they will also identify that the whisper of the Lord was there. It was a very cool thing. I remember one day in our small group, and it was also like, and I've been going to church for a long time, but when you go up to Timberley, you go to like 2 very long chapel services twice. I said 2 already, you know, just to emphasize the point. But you go to these chapel services twice a day. And so you're in church for a long time, but I somehow wasn't becoming fatigued or bored. I was just interested. And sure enough, a lot of us, you know, felt like we were hearing the whisper of the Lord. And there were a few of us who were very serious about following the call that we felt like the whisper of the Lord was calling us. We wanted to be a distinct or like a set apart at Roosevelt. We didn't want to just follow what everybody else was doing. We didn't want to like perpetuate the middle school toxicity that was happening. And we were very intent when we came back. We even had like a bunch of different hand signals that we made on the bus ride back to like communicate things secretly. We thought we were like these clandestine disciples who were going out into the middle school. And that was very cool. So from then I entered into the confirmation class we had very shortly after coming back from that trip. And I went through the class. Pastor Lundeen helped lead that. And I'm sure a bunch of you also made appearances there. And I remember when it came time for the end of the class, it was like, all right, you had to give your statement to the session. And that's sort of the first. I'm sure some of you were there and remember me doing something very similar to this there. And then you had to, you know, be confirmed in front of the congregation. And I remember I was talking with Pastor Davis and Pastor Lundeen and my parents, and they were like, "Oh, you have to be baptized before you go through the confirmation thing." And I was like, "Wait, what? I haven't been baptized yet?" Because I'd never seen anybody older than like infant age be baptized. I was like, how has this happened? Like, did I miss some appointment that I was supposed to go to be baptized? I didn't really ask my dad why, because I don't think any of me or my siblings were baptized as babies. So I don't know, maybe my dad can answer that question later. But I remember at that point, my parents were like, yeah, you have to become baptized now. And I was like unsure whether I wanted to do it or not. I didn't really understand. I was like, okay, I've never really seen somebody have to make this decision as like a conscious adult. I didn't really know the ramifications of what making that decision meant. So I asked Pastor Lundeen about it. She sort of like gave me the very simple version of the sermon series that Paul is doing about like why baptism is important and what it means. And I was like, eventually I said, okay, this is something I want to do. And so that like 7th to 8th grade year, I remember I heard the whisper of the Lord, and then we went through confirmation, and then I said, yes, I want to be baptized. And I think that's where the story became not a Brennan story, but it became a Conrad Brennan story with Jesus. And so then I think this is probably the shortest part of my story, going off to high school. But there are two names that are extremely important for understanding how I managed going through Oak Park High School at OPRF. Jake Grant and Ben Hancock, I've alluded to both of them already, but they had a massive impact on me as a high school student. I'm still extremely close to both of them. I get on the phone with them still like weekly. Even now that we're literally in 3 different corners of the country. I live in California, and then there's Ben up in New Jersey, and then Jake in Atlanta. But somehow these bonds that were being strengthened while we were in high school were extremely strong, and I'm very grateful for them. I met Jake here. We had been friends for much longer, and we were on that Timberley trip together. And Ben was the year below us, but we sort of adopted him up into when he sort of came over to Oak Park. And there was a transition period here where Paul Bailey had stepped down and he moved on to something else. So there was a big vacancy in the youth program, which was filled by a bunch of different other people. Sam Hutchins. He was our freshman year small group leader. So we had gotten to meet Sam before he filled the temporary role of youth director. And he's such an awesome guy. If you haven't met or interacted with Sam very much, that small group met in my basement. My mom was always bringing us snacks. So thanks, Mom. And yeah, that small group was very cool as well. It was like the second in a long line of really excellent boys small groups here at the church. So, I mean, I'm sure some of you are leading small groups, you're doing a really invaluable service. I still remember a lot of the conversations we had in these groups. And then we had the triumvirate of youth leaders, Allison Kuzer, Steve Compare, and Kyle Studer, who sort of came in and then took the reins for a little while. And then finally, they hired Mark Philly. So Mark came on the scene, and I remember I wasn't able to go to his sort of like interview down in the youth room one Sunday because I was warming up for some praise band activity. But I remember when he showed up, everyone was raving about him. He was like this awesome guy. And we were so enthusiastic when he came into the role of youth pastor. And he really supercharged a lot of the programs that we have. There was always something interesting happening. There was always something for us to do. So in the summer, we were there was the 3 things, and usually they were back to back. It was crazy. I don't know how we managed to do this, but we did RSG, and then we went on the trip to Jekyll, which became Hilton Head. It was like a 22-hour bus ride. It's crazy. I saw Jack Bell walking around. He remembers those trips. And then there was the mission trip where we went. There was the Sun Servants trip that we went on. So the summer was just jam-packed. I remember always taking a few weeks off of work to go and participate on these trips. And then outside of the youth ministry, I started to become involved in sort of the worship ministry. I was a classical pianist by training, but I wasn't exemplary at that. So, but Rick Sutton knew that I had like played the piano a little bit, and I was always like sort of poking my head around the praise band people. And so he sort of took me under his wing, and we were here in the Maxwell room a few times, and he was like trying to teach me to read like the contemporary music, and he was showing me how to play things. And eventually Mark Whiteside had me come and do a few songs in front of the congregation. And that was something I really enjoyed doing. And then I remember I spoke to Jake Grant. Yeah, Nancy was there for a lot of times. Nancy probably remembers the first time they invited me. I think I forget what song we were singing. It was in the key of G though. I remember.
I do not remember.
But
That's great.
yeah, I don't know. But then we got Jake in there eventually playing drums. And it was a really awesome time to be part of that. So I was like doing all sorts of stuff around the church building. I was probably here like 4 days a week, or in my basement, or and then eventually went to the Hancock's basement for TN. TN, by the way, stands for Tuesday nights, but it ended up being on a Wednesday. Yeah, it was always on a Wednesday. Yeah, I think it's still not on the right day. But I also really wanted to be involved with academics. I was trying to take them very seriously because my parents always emphasized that you have to be really strong in your academics. It's something that they really valued, and I appreciate that I inherited that value from them. And so I was always really trying to juggle schoolwork and church activities. And it became challenging because I was having a lot of fun interacting with other people in the church, and the academics started to get difficult and more important. And my parents began to emphasize it more and more to the point where I was like, oh, shoot. Maybe what I'm doing at First Pres is detracting instead of contributing to what I'm supposed to be doing. So, and I use that "supposed to be" in quotes because that's still something that I think is difficult for me at this point in my life, and I don't think it really gets any easier. Maybe you are, yeah, that's what I thought. But really trying to discern whether or not you're doing the right thing or you're following the right path. I didn't know when I was in high school, and then I started to become interested in questions like, what is God's plan for me? And that I still don't really know the answer to that question. I don't think any of us really know. It keeps changing, yeah. And trying to really like feel that out became a lot of times a point of contention between me and my folks. I remember saying like, I feel like, I'm supposed to be doing this. And they would say no. And I found my parents very hard to impress. I feel like they were pretty, they had very high standards. And I remember feeling like there's elements where no matter what I did or how hard I tried, I wouldn't be at like the Brenneman standard of excellence. My parents have this saying, they say GB, which stands both for Go Brennemans and Go Beyond. They were always telling me to go beyond. It didn't really matter if I had made this position on the tennis team. They said, oh, GB, go beyond that. Or it didn't matter if I scored, this well on the exam, you had a GB, you had to go beyond that. And I remember constantly trying to live up to these expectations and root out my parents' approval, which became extremely taxing. But not only am I thankful for, how strongly they emphasize, being excellent, this I also appreciate from them. I found it disheartening, and I didn't agree with everything that they did, but I learned this valuable lesson really early on that I think people my age are still in the process of beginning to learn. that you can't please everybody and you shouldn't try to please other people. And eventually you just have to sit back and say, all right, I know that you believe that this is something that's important, but I just don't believe that. And I'm going to do my own thing. And I think that's where I became less of a follower and more of a leader. And I obviously follow your, and Paul's like, hey, emulate me as I emulate Christ. So I was like, okay, well, I'm going to follow Christ, and by doing that, I'm going to forge my own path. I'm going to lead a path. And that really, when it came to deciding where I wanted to go to college, that became a really important thing. Because a lot of other, people were telling me what I should or shouldn't be doing. And ultimately I said, you know what? I'm going to make this decision for myself, because I think, I've got to listen to where I think I'm being called, and I'm not going to, really cater to all these other opinions on what I should or shouldn't be doing. So I think, while I was still in high school, I started becoming extremely interested in the natural sciences, which was sometimes difficult because there's like this prevalent message in society that God and science are in opposition to each other. And that was something that I heard all the time. I was extremely interested, especially in chemistry. I was almost obsessed with it. In fact, before I had even gone to my high school chemistry class, I had learned a lot of just the basic mechanics of how it worked just by reading books and listening to lectures. I had memorized the periodic table before I was an 8th grader. In fact, my science teacher at the time gave me this tiny periodic table.
Does it change since you?
It has.
Yeah,
Yes.
Okay.
It has changed since I first memorized it. But I thought this was fascinating. It seemed almost like a science fiction thing. It seemed almost cooler than the wildest fantasy. Like the reality was even more fascinating. So I really started diving headfirst into that, and I took a few chemistry classes at Oak Park, and then I even student taught one of those classes. And my chemistry teachers were extremely instrumental in my development as a student and as a person. One of them, Dave Bernthal, was also a Christian. And I remember, I didn't know that explicitly when I started his course, but over the course of the year, I remember, I was like, wait a second, there's something, he would do, some of the things that he would say, you could interpret 2 different ways. And I was like, I think, and he knew that I attended here because one of his brothers was involved in the youth program at one time. And so not only did I take my chemistry class very seriously, I also competed. I did the science Olympiad a few times. I went to nationals once, and I scored in the top 150 people, which is not terrible. And I remember as I was preparing for this competition, I would always be in Bernthal's office, no matter, like I would ditch other classes. But I would, any moment I got, I would go to Bernthal's office. Sometimes he wasn't even in his office, he was teaching other classes. So I would go to his other classes, and I would sit in the back, and I would be studying these manuals. Sometimes he'd have me come up and, do something in front of his other classes, which was fun. But the times when we were in his office during lunch or other occasions, we didn't always just talk about science. We talked about science through the lens of how the creation brings glory to God, which I thought was really interesting. Because I'd always been hearing like, science and God, they're really in 2 different schools of thought. There are 2 different categories. You can't have a foot in both camps. But I saw, okay, this is like a professional scientist who also has a profound faith. And his understanding of science influences and augments his faith. And I was like, oh, that's really cool. So I said, all right, now that I am understanding that science isn't at odds with my relationship with Jesus, this is something I want to study more. So when I went off to college, I wanted to study chemistry, and that's what I did. Before I left, though, this is like, I remember adding this into my little notes like last night. I was like, how did I forget this? The summer before Jake and I left for college, we did something kind of zany. During RSG that year, we had created this whole series of skits. Because when we were in Ready, Set, Go, when Paul Daly was the youth director, we remember that there were these skits that they would do. And then once there was the whole transition, and then Mark came along, and those skits had been lost. So we were like, we're going to bring back the skits. And so we created the Pious Pirates. So you may have heard of the Pious Pirates. It's sort of a First Pres legend now. But we dressed up in these awful costumes, and we got this whole like film crew together. We wrote scripts, and it was like a month before RSG actually started, and we went around filming these. And my brother Edward helped. He has a lot of talents, but one of his talents is like digital and media, editing and composition. And so he helped us edit it, and it was like the quality was awful back then. Like if you watch them now, it doesn't look like it was very impressive. But we had created this thing, and Mark Fillion, he did like film as one of his majors at school. So he was helping us get like the most professional angles. We're like, we don't know what
Is it on YouTube?
No, it's not. No, this one is not. But we remember after we did this, it was a huge hit with all the campers. And so the leaders after the year after, Ben Hancock was then, because he was the year below us, so he kept it going. There was a second season the next year. Yeah, last week during RSG, they just did season 7 of the thing that we had created a long time ago. And I remember I was in one of the RSG leaders meetings, and Jack said, hey, what are your highlights of the week? And a lot of them said the videos, like participating in the videos, talking about them with their students. And so it was just something that we had created and like recreated. And so I thought it deserved a place in my faith story, because it's just like, it's silly, but somehow it's been an instrumental part of a bunch of other people's faith stories. Yeah, we still look back fondly. We're coming up on the 10-year anniversary, so we might be putting them on DVDs. Yeah, so then I went off to college, and this was very different, and this is where probably a lot of you lost track of me, because I remember I gave something on Youth Sunday, I talked in front of the congregation, and then you probably didn't see me again for a while. There were a bunch of different facial hair variations that happened. Then I went to the University of California, and I was there to study chemistry, and right away things just started going awful. It was not good. I was like the only person from OPRF who was going to this school. So I really didn't know anybody. I didn't know anybody. And when I went to go tour the school was the very first time I had been to the state of California. I think my dad will probably say I went there as like an infant for some trip, but that doesn't count really. So I was totally isolated from First Pres and from everybody who I knew. Like a week and a half before I left, like everything was packed up in these boxes. They were already on their way. I got appendicitis. And it was this whole episode where for like the first few days, and I remember it was right when the Rio Olympics opening ceremony was happening. My family was watching the opening ceremony in our basement, and I had this really uncomfortable stomachache. And it was like a whole day before I actually convinced people that it was not just some random affliction. I was like, yeah, I think I need some medical attention. So we went to the emergency room and they checked me out. They're like, yeah, our appendix is going down the tubes. We need to cut this thing out. So I was like, yeah. So I got the surgery and they removed the appendix, and then they were like, all right, well, you can't do any physical activity, strenuous, you can't do any of that. And I was like, well, tough luck, because I've got to move into my new dorm room in a few days. And none of my folks came. Nobody was there. It was just me. So I flew out there and I got off the plane, I got on a train, got to Berkeley, and I walked like a mile and a half with my suitcase to my dorm, went to the mailroom, got all of my stuff, and I went to the building where my dorm was. There was no elevator. I got these freaking like stitches in my side. They just sewn me up. And they took my appendix out. And I was like, I literally know nobody in this half of the country. There's nobody here who can help me. I had to go knock on random doors and say, you don't know who I am, but I live 3 floors above you, and I'm in a lot of pain and I need your help. And I remember a few very nice people, other freshmen, came and they helped me move these things up the stairs. But God was not finished throwing trials and tribulations my way, because I thought before that I was really good at chemistry. And I tell you that I was like in the top 150 people in the country, because like my very first chemistry class had like 150 people in it. So I was like, theoretically, I could be the worst person in this room. And I was under the impression, once I got there, I was like, oh shit, all these people are really smart. And the first class that I walked into, the professor's like, yeah, so this is like the super duper intro chemistry class just for the chemistry majors. And AP doesn't even get you out of it. It's like this, like that's like a prerequisite for this class. And I was like, oh shoot. And already in like the first 2 weeks, they're doing like quantum theories. And I'm like, oh my gosh. So I've got stitches in my side. I don't know anybody. The academics are extremely intense. I remember going into my first midterm and I was like shaking. It was really kind of frightening. And then October rolls around and my roommate and I realized that we had bed bugs in our room. And my mom, I think, when I told my mom, she was like, how did you let this happen? I was like, me? What? So we had bed bugs. And for a while, this doesn't say a lot of nice things about the campus that I was at, but I don't really blame them. There were like thousands of kids there. But we went to like the housing department and we had been calling them and sending them emails. And it was like extremely slow and tedious. And we couldn't sleep in our beds anymore because we were getting bitten. So we were sleeping like out in the common area on some couches. My roommate, he was from San Francisco, so he had a lot of friends who were there. So he was like crashing in their rooms. And they helped me out a lot too. But it was like a massive pain in the butt to fix this problem that was just super bad. So eventually, when we finally got them to take notice, they came with like the dogs or whatever that can sniff out the bed. They're like, yeah, you have them. We're like, yeah, we know. And then they were like, all right, so you can only take like non-fibrous things out of your room. Only take what you need and the clothes on your back, pretty much. And we're going to relocate you to a different room while we get this sorted out. And they relocated us all the way across campus. So all the people in the dorm who I managed to meet and make friends with, wasn't seeing them anymore. I had learned how to like all the routes to my classes and all the buildings. No, those were all useless. I was starting over from scratch in this empty
Scratch.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, exactly. And so I just remember like October, November were really awful. And I remember I was sitting in this empty dorm room. None of my stuff was there, totally empty. One afternoon, oh my gosh. And then I had this old rinky dink laptop and the battery died. And I was like, now I can't even do schoolwork. So I'm like, pulling out like the random change that I have, and I'm like scrounging it up to go to the Apple store and get this fixed. I've got nothing. I've got like 2 outfits that I'm interchanging. It was awful. And I remember sitting in this empty dorm room one day, and I just started crying. I was like, I don't know what to do. And I remember I was like, I need to hear the whisper of the Lord. And I just sat there for a while. I remember I was literally lying on the floor, just listening for the whisper of the Lord to come by. And that became a practice, not always on the floor, but in this empty dorm room where I knew nobody. After I was done with classes, I would come back and I would just listen for the whisper of the Lord to come by. And I slowly began to hear the whisper of the Lord, and the presence of the Lord was there. And I remember he comforted me. I began to become involved at First Presbyterian Church at Berkeley, which is right across the street from the campus. And it was very different. When I walked in, nobody had ever heard the name Brenneman before. So it was a very different environment. And I remember one of the college ministry groups was meeting on Wednesday nights when I had a class. It was a really important class that I had to be at. It was a lab prep session. So you had to go if you wanted to do the lab. And so I could never miss it. And I could never go to the university group. And really, because I wasn't able to go my freshman year, I kind of missed the boats. Like they had all gotten to know each other really well. And I remember I went a few times in subsequent years, and I knew a few of them. But I felt like I wasn't really part of their group. And I remember going to a few small groups, and I remember thinking this is like a downgrade from the small group that I had in high school. The small groups that I had here were like, in some ways, far and away from the small groups that I was able to go to at Berkeley. Mark Fillion was our small group leader when I was a junior and a senior here. And we studied like really intense stuff. We went through the book of Romans. And I remember the first small group that I went to in Berkeley was also going through the book of Romans, but it was like not as good. I was like, yeah, I've heard this before, and I'm not really learning anything new or deepening my faith. And of course, I no longer was going to school with Ben and Jake or anyone else sort of in the First Pres community anymore. So I remember I was trying to hold on to this very strong faith that I had cultivated in high school without really knowing anybody. But I did start, one of the things that I was extremely thankful for that I think was very impactful was I was able to be part of one of the choirs at First Pres Berkeley. Now, First Pres Berkeley had 2 different choirs, and they were both larger than our choir. There were a lot of people who were singing in the choir, and so I remember showing up. There was like the chancel choir, and then there was it was called the College and Young Adult Choir, CAYAC, C-A-Y-A-C. And I remember showing up, and there was no other college kids, so I was 2 of the letters, college and then everyone else was just the young adult choir. And I remember showing up, and I was like, I'm here to sing with your choir. And they were like, all right. And the choir director at the time, I still talk to, and she probably more than anybody else helped me through things like bed bugs and the broken computer and the appendix and, all that sort of stuff. Her name is Lee Wen Monk. And so if you are ever in the Berkeley area, swing by First Pres Berkeley. She's now like the worship coordinator. She's no longer just the choir director. She does like all of the contemporary and the traditional services, and she organizes the music and the organ and all that. So I know I'm running out of time. So after I graduated from college, this is sort of like where I am now. I really entered a rocky place with God. I felt like, sorry, it's Jacob who was wrestling with God. I was like, oh man. So right after my senior year of college, I had been dating this girl, and we broke up my senior year, and then COVID started happening. Then one of I lived with two roommates for two of my latter 2 years of college. Shortly after I fake graduated, because there wasn't a ceremony, shortly after that, I remember returning to California because I had to move all my stuff out because the lease was ending. 2 days after I moved everything out, one of my roommates was murdered randomly on the streets. It was a totally random incident. The person who murdered him, they had never met before. The story is pretty grisly, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. But I remember one of my other roommates came to my new apartment, and he called me up and he said, "Hey, you got to let me in right now." And I remember buzzing him in, and he came up and he told me, "Hey, Seth is dead." And I was like, "What?" And the cops had to like interview us. So I remember I went back to my old place, and the cops were like combing through his stuff in my old room, and they were trying to figure this out. They eventually caught him. Yeah, yay. But I remember we all went to his funeral. His mom and his sister were there, and he was an extremely bright kid. Shortly after that, I got the news about Mark. And I was like, oh man, I feel like I'm really wrestling in the mud with God right now. And then, yeah, it was a mess. It was a real mess. And, but out of that mess, I remember I was applying different jobs, and a bunch of different types of jobs. I worked in a lab for a lot of my time at school. So I'd applied to a bunch of these lab positions. I wanted to maybe, do some research. There was a pharmaceutical place that I was interested in. I also applied for a teaching position at a high school in Oakland. And they got back to me. They were like, "Oh, you should do this interview." It wasn't really an interview. It was like they had these pre-recorded questions that you would record. It was a one-way interview. And it felt very awkward. And I was like, well, I'm just this kid. I just graduated, but I know a lot about science. So, and then apparently that was good enough for them. Then they said, "Oh, let's have a real interview now. So prepare to teach us a lesson on something in your field." And so I had prepared this lesson. It was about chemical equilibria. And I gave it to them. And on the Zoom call, it was the principal of the school, the vice principal, and one of their STEM directors. And I remember the vice principal saying, "You're a really strange applicant." So you're just this random kid, and you don't have any experience doing this, and you've never lived in Oakland. Why are you doing this? And I explained to them, I was like, look, when I was in middle school and high school, the teachers were my heroes. I looked up to them a lot. They were models for me. That's why I want to do this. And then they asked me about, then the STEM director took over. He asked me a bunch of questions about science. And I got a phone call a little while later. They were like, "Yeah, we want you to come teach chemistry at this school." I was like, all right. I remember talking to Ben and Jake the week before this had happened. And I was like, yeah, I was chasing these other leads, these other like companies. And then I also applied to this one teaching job. And they were like, "Oh, that's going to be interesting or weird or cool or something." And I remember telling them that I took the job, and they were mostly supportive. They had some questions for me. And I want to read you some passages before we finish up. And these are passages that I cling to, Bible passages that I cling to a lot as a science teacher. Now I teach chemistry and physics, so, you know, moving up in the world. And I really, that sort of reconciling faith and science is still something that people ask me a lot about at First Pres Berkeley still. People are like, oh, that's interesting. Some people have a lot of like really out there theories about, you know, how figure out how creationism happened. And I'll just say like, oh yeah, that's a good theory. So Ben was preaching on Job this week for RSG. And there are two passages from Job that I really appreciate when it comes to science and God. And the first one is Job 12, 7 through 10. And this is Job telling his friends after they're doubting that God is like with him. And Job says, ask the animals and they will teach you, or the birds in the sky, they will tell you, or speak to the earth and it will teach you, or let the fish in the sea inform you. Which of all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? In his hand is the life of every creature and the breath of all mankind. And yeah, it's a really cool passage just hidden there in the Old Testament. And Job is saying like, look, the world is declaring, yes, the glory of the Lord. And so when I am teaching these kids, obviously, you know, Ben is one of my mentors and friends, and he's off like actually teaching people about the Bible and about Jesus. But I think I'm also doing that because of this passage. And then there's another passage later on when one of Job's friends comes back and tells Job something similar. And this is Job 37, 14 to 16. He says, listen to this, Job. I like that. Listen to this. It's like me with my students. Listen to this. Stop and consider God's wonders. Do you know how God controls the clouds and makes the lightning flash? Do you know how the clouds hang poised, those wonders of him who has perfect knowledge? That's really cool. Because like studying science, we get a glimpse as to how the clouds work and how the lightning strikes. And I can tell you a little bit about how that happens. And I can tell my students a little bit about how that happens. But all in all, there's still things that we don't know about how this works. And so I think when you really look into all of these scientific phenomena, you see the fingerprints of God. And that's sort of where I'm at now and why I'm convicted to do this. I talked for a long time, but thank you for letting me speak to you all. So thanks for having me. Thank you.